Today we're going to be looking at how to place a hole in the ground with a super beginner workflow. Like always, you can download everything I use down below, so let's go ahead and get started. So inside of Blender, the first thing that we need to do is go ahead and motion track our footage. So I'm going to go ahead and plus VFX and motion tracking, and then open up our footage. I went ahead and converted my video into a image sequence, so I'm just going to hit A to select all the PNG sequences and then open the clip. And then we can go ahead and set the scene frames and prefetch our footage. Also, we notice that the color is off, so I'm going to come up to render, color management, and then down to standard, and now it's looking a lot better. Let's also go ahead and set the frame rate. So I'm going to come to the output settings, go to frame rate, and set it to 30 FPS. So if I scroll throughout our footage, we'll notice that we're closer to the paper at the end. So that's where I'm actually going to start the tracking process. So let's go ahead, control click to add that, and then alt S, to add a search size. We actually want to increase this so that the pattern size is going over our entire X right here. So I'm going to make this, say, to a 40 pattern size. So that's much better. Now our search size is much smaller, so I'm going to change it up to like a 95. Let's see that. I just found with testing, this is kind of the size that works the best for this specific shot. So I'm going to delete those. And then we need to go ahead, instead of tracking just the location, we can do the location, rotation, and scale, and then normalize our footage. And also we want to set the match to previous frame. These are just kind of all the settings that work best when I was testing this scene. Now we just need to control click all the middle of our little X's so that we can actually track the scene. So now that we have markers on all of those, I want to go ahead and add some more markers around this area, just whatever Blender thinks that it can track to. So I'm going to come up here and detect some features. And we're going to come down here. I'm going to go set the threshold to a 0.01. And then the distance to an 80, just so we have a ton of trackers on our scene. Let's go ahead and hit A again to select all the previous trackers we had. And then if we hold Control Shift T, it'll actually track backwards, or you can hit this button right here. Okay, so what's nice is that we actually have a lot of markers that made it to the very beginning of our footage, so that's going to be very useful for tracking. So let's go ahead and get a solve. Let's come up to the solve section. My A and B keyframe with the most parallax, I noticed that it's around like a 140 to 180 is where I really like shift a lot in my camera movement. So again, 140 to 180 right there. Then let's refine all of this stuff and go ahead and solve our camera motion. Okay, so we got a 0.6 solve error, and the line is relatively straight right here. So that's all looking good. Let's go ahead and clean that up a little bit. So I'm going to clean the tracks and then put the reprojection up to, let's say, like a 0.75. Then delete those and resolve our motion. Okay, so that got it down to a 0.4. Let's just do that a couple more times until we get a good result. Okay, so I cleaned my tracks a couple more times and was able to get a 0.19 solve error, which is really good. The most important thing, of course, is that our blue little solve line down here is straight all the way across, so that's going to give us a really good track. So let's go ahead and set up our tracking scene, because you'll notice up here we don't have anything set up yet. So I'm going to scroll down. Let's go ahead and set the background and the tracking scene up. And it's not orientated to our screen. Luckily, we have our piece of paper, which is a flat object, and we can use that to define our floor. So I'm going to select this point, and this point, and this point to be our floor, and press the floor icon over there. And then we need to go ahead and set the origin. I'm just going to set it to be this middle point right there. So set the origin there. And then one of these in line, in this line, I'm going to set to be our x-axis. And then let's go ahead and set up the correct scale for our scene, which is going to be very important for depth of field and if you need to place any, realistically sized objects in your scene. So we have this piece of paper, which is a good reference. Normal piece of paper is about 11 inches long ways. And so we'll notice that about 2 inches are cut off from the side here from these 2 points. So let's go ahead and first just select these 2 points right here. And then let's actually convert that into meters. So I actually have up here, we need to convert 9 inches into meters. And so here is the, 9 inches into meters. We'll copy that number. And then what we can do is set the scale and then paste that number into our distance. And now that's basically made the correct size of our entire scene. And so now let's come out to the layout view. And just to have some fun, let's see how well our camera is actually matched. Let's come to the first frame. I'm just going to hide these for now. Come to the side view. And I'm about a 6'2" guy. I was roughly filming around my waist, so we'll say it was about 3 feet. And so let's get our measuring stick over here. And then that. And so we'll say 1.1 meters. Let's do 1.1 meters, 2 feet is roughly 3.6 meters, which is exactly where I was filming, roughly around my waist area, so half of my size. So that just shows that we can get a very accurate kind of, scene scale in our scene. Let's go ahead and get out of that. Alt H to unhide everything. And Blender went ahead and set up some stuff. We're just going to undo some of the stuff it set up. So delete the background and foreground view layer. We can go ahead and delete all of this stuff. So the light, ground, and the cube, we're going to go ahead and delete all this stuff. So we just have the camera now. And then we actually need to go to the background view layer. We're just going to delete that. And then in the compositing tab, let's just delete these 4 nodes and then plug our movie clip into the alpha over. So now we can go back out to the layout tab, and we actually want to go ahead and start setting up our hole that we want in our scene. So to do that, what I'm going to do is Shift A, add a mesh circle, and we're just going to size that down roughly around like there for now. And then we actually want kind of to make our hole a little bit jagged, to add some, 3D realism in the scene, like a meteor came down and, struck it and tore the fabric and everything, the carpet. So what we can do is add a displace modifier. And what that's going to do is whatever we set as our texture, it's actually going to displace the geometry. So I'm going to make a new texture. I'm just going to name that the hole. Then we can come down to the texture properties, and instead of it being a movie or image sequence, we can go ahead and make this clouds, which you can always think as clouds as kind of just the noise of the texture settings. We can play around with a little bit of this. You'll notice that we don't have a lot of geometry to work with, so I'm going to come back up to the modifier section, add a subdivision surface modifier, and we're just going to place that before our displace modifier just so we have some more vertices. I am going to increase the amount to like a 3, maybe even a 4, just so we have a lot of vertices to work with. Let's go back to the texture section, and let's play around with some of the size. Let's say like around there. You can play with it yourself. Of course, we can also increase the brightness to shrink it, and then the contrast to make it, more jagged or less jagged or whatever you want. Honestly, this is kind of just where you can play around with it and have a little bit of fun. You will see it's sticking very closely to a 4, which is very important because that's going to really sell the effect. And so once you're happy with kind of the result that you have right here, so what we can do is go ahead and apply all of our modifiers. So I'm going to go ahead and apply the subdivision for surface and the displace modifier. And so now we have actual geometry to work with. So what we can do is I'm going to go ahead and hit go to edge select just so we're in the edge select. Also, we're in edit mode. Just come up here to the edit mode. Then if we hit E, that'll extrude, and then if we hit S, that'll scale everything out. And so basically, we just want our scaled out version over here to basically cover the entire frame. Okay, so now we can see that we have our base footage in the middle here, and that's the only thing that we can see. What we actually want to do now is set all of this material out here to basically show only the transparency of our scene. And so to do that, first of all, let's go ahead and do some render settings. So I'm going to come up to render. Let's go to cycles. I'm just going to turn the denoise off for me and then set this down to like 512. And this can just be a 64 since we don't really need that much resolution. Also, if you have a GPU, I recommend setting it to GPU compute. Now what we can do is go ahead and add a material to our scene, because if we come out to the render view, everything is just an ugly gray color. So let's go ahead and add a new material. Name this material holdout. And of course, what that means is we're going to set it to be a holdout object. And so let's come up here and then select the holdout preset. And what that is going to basically do is whatever is set to be your holdout is basically just going to show the transparency of the scene. Basically, everything else behind it is not going to be rendered at all. So that's why you can see we basically have our world texture right now cut out in here. Let's go ahead and get a little fancy with it. I want to increase the kind of, cavity down here to where there's a little bit of overhang, like the carpet is overhanging a little bit. So let's, alt select that if you are in edge select mode. Let's E to extrude that, and then Z to just extrude that down a little bit. Now you can see we basically created like a little edge that adds some 3D into our scene. And so let's go ahead and alt click that in face mode just to select the face loop. And then what we can do is add a new material, and this material we're going to name the carpet. like that. And then if we have all this selected, we can just hit assign, and now we can see that all these faces up here are set to be our holdout texture, and then all the faces in the middle are set to be our carpet texture. Okay, so we'll worry about texturing a little bit later. Let's go ahead and set up the hole in our little scene right here. So again, we're just going to go ahead and Shift A, add a mesh. We're going to do the same exact thing. We're going to add a circle. Just make that a little bit less. We do want to make sure it covers up the entire size of the hole. Then again, we're just going to add a displace modifier. We're going to add a new texture. We're just going to call this hole 2, because why not? We're going to come back down to the texture settings again, just go to clouds, just so we get all that, and then add a subdivision surface modifier above our displace modifier and increase that. So now that we have this effect, I'm actually just going to decrease out just a little bit. We don't need that many vertices there. Then texture settings, then let's play around with this a little bit, because we want this to kind of be more circular rather than jagged like this. And so the size, we'll increase that to like something like that. And then we can do the brightness, we'll just keep it around there. We also need, let's just go ahead and rotate it on the Z-axis. And then I think that's pretty much all I'm going to do. Because again, I don't want it as jagged as, you know, our whole centerpiece. So let's come back up to the modifiers tab. And again, let's just go ahead and apply both of those. And now let's go ahead and we want to come to the side view. I want to make the hole lower than our floor plane. So I'm just going to GZ move that there. Okay, so now we just have to extrude this down. Let's go into the edit mode by hitting tab up there. First, let's make a face. So hit F to, you know, select all that. And then we need to hit E to extrude that down. And we're just gonna, we need to actually come first. Let's select the top and then delete the top face, just so we have like kind of a cylinder looking thing. Then let's select the bottom again. We want to go to like the place where we're going to see the most down, and I don't want to see the bottom of the hole, so I'm just going to pull it all the way down until we don't really see the bottom. So if I scrub throughout here, we don't see the bottom, so that's good. So right there is where I'm going to leave that. And then we can actually go ahead and shade smooth. And let's go ahead and do some texturing, just because our hole is now, you know, in there. And of course you can do whatever on the other side of this. You can even make it a portal into another world. So just play around and have some fun with that. But I'm going to make it into a hole. And so if you go to Polyhaven, you can download this texture. I just downloaded the 2K, since any higher, you know, kind of lags up my machine. And so let's go ahead and apply that texture. Let's come over here. I'm just going to bring out a new shading editor, hit N to hide that. And then let's add a new material. I'm going to name this just hole. Now I'm naming a lot of stuff hole. And then if you have the Node Wrangler add-on, what we can do is just click that and then Control-Shift-T to add a principal texture setup. And then just locate wherever you downloaded your files. I'm just going to select all of them, hit the principal texture setup. And that's done a pretty good job already. You will see that we don't have like any, you know, lighting in our scene, so it's very hard to see anything right now. So I'm just going to add a simple area light right there and bring that up a little bit, and maybe, you know, change the power up. Just for now, we can play around with that a little bit later. But nothing is showing, and that's actually because we haven't unwrapped our scene. So let's go ahead and do that. Instead of letting Blender kind of, you know, smart UV unwrap it, let's just go ahead and unwrap it ourselves. And so with the bottom kind of selected here, what I can do is, if I'm in edge select mode, I can just right click and then go ahead and mark a seam like that. And then since we're not really seeing this side, I can go ahead and mark this as a seam too. So I'm just gonna right click, mark seam right there. And then now what we can do is hit A to select everything, and then go hit U and unwrap. And we basically just UV unwrapped it. If you want to check out your UV, you can come out to the UV editing workspace. You can see this is a pretty nice UV. That's why I unwrapped it the way I did. So now if we come back over here, go into render view, you can now see that we have our rock layer. And then if we Alt H to unhide our holdout, we can see that we're only seeing the you know, the rock layer in here, which is really nice. If I, you know, hide this top layer, we can see all this render down here. And so that's just a nice thing that the holdout does, is kind of remove all the rendering down here. So now that looked awful. Like that looks super amateurish. The lighting needs a lot of work, all this stuff. So let's go ahead and use this displacement to actually get some nice displacement in our scene. And so right now it's not using any of the points for any of the displacement. And that's actually because by default every texture is set to only use the normal map to only affect the texture geometry. And that's good for if you wanting to see far away objects and objects that aren't close to you. But since we are so close that we're actually going to see the 3D detail of the rocks, we can actually use this displacement map, which is giving us this data to actually affect the actual geometry of the thing. So if I come down to these settings and then scroll all the way down to displacement, or sorry, go to settings and then displacement down here, you'll see that right now it's set to be bump only. And that's, again, only affecting the kind of texturing of the image, not really affecting the geometry. So what we want to do instead is set it to be a displacement only. And you can see that that's done some weird stuff. And basically that's using this, again, displacement map that we have in our textures to basically displace the geometry. But if we go to edit mode again, we'll notice that we don't have a lot of geometry. We basically have, one face going all the way down. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and I'm just going to manually add some, geometry. Of course, you could use the subdivision surface modifier, but I just like kind of manually adding the geometry I need. So I'm going to hit Control R and I'm just going to, with my scroll all the way up until we get, a lot of, edge loops there. And now we have a ton more geometry. So now if we go back out to the render tab, we can see that we have our rocks actually, protruding how they would in the actual, space. So what we need to do is, this looks terrible again. We need to affect our mid-level, which if I hide this, you'll notice that if I come up here and select this object, the mid-level is basically just how extruded out the faces are. So if I go ahead and affect that, it will bring the faces back in line basically with this yellow line so that the rocks kind of stick around there. If I come into the camera mode now, we will see that the rocks are extruding way too far out, and that's where the scale comes into play. So we're just gonna scale that down a little bit, something like that. That's looking a little bit better. And then let's go ahead and render out a image just to see what we're working with. Okay, so now you can see that we're getting a lot more detail with our rocks and it's looking a lot more realistic. Of course, you can, if you want more detail and want to crank up the realism a lot, it will, eat into your PC. But if you have a good enough PC, you might as well add a, subdivision surface modifier. This is fine for what I'm using it for, so we're going to leave it like that. Next, let's actually go ahead and make some texture for our carpet. So I'm going to come up here, go to the carpet tab, and then we can go ahead and go down to the materials. We're in the carpet material, which is good. We want to go ahead and just add a image texture, and then we can just use our image sequence as before. So here it is. I'm going to hit A, open the image sequence, and plug that into the base color. And then what we want to do is I want to go ahead and go into the editing mode, hit A to select everything, and then U, and we're going to do project from view. And what that will do is basically project everything from our view to the actual object. So now if we move around the scene, you can see that we have some of our carpet texture actually kind of baked into the material right here. First of all, let's come up to the camera tab, and then let's make our background images, opacity a little bit higher so we can actually see what we're working with a little bit more. I do want to make the actual material a little bit darker, so let's do a gamma node. Just plug that into there, and then we can turn down the gamma just a little bit, just so it's a darker edge right there. We're gonna do a few compositing tricks to kind of blend it in a little bit more. And so now what we can do is we need to actually play around with the lighting of our scene. Now the lighting of my actual real world scene that I shot in was pretty bright and very tan, so I'm just gonna make the ambient color kind of this tan color. And now with our area light, let's just play around with that a little bit more to get a more, realistic result. The power is way too high, so I'm going to do something like that. And then the size, we can just increase that or decrease that just a little bit. So something like that. Of course, you can play around with it on your own, but this is looking fine for what I'm using this scene for. So yeah, so that is pretty much everything that I'm going to be doing for this shot. Of course, you know, play around with some of the materials and have some fun with it. You know, add like a world down here, make it fun and exciting. Now this is the part where I actually take it into compositing. Now usually I do this in Nuke, and actually the example you saw at the start was in Nuke, but of course I want to stick inside of Blender for this, so let's go up to the compositing tab. And again, let's render out an image so we can see the actual hole that we're working with. Okay, so it's not looking too bad. This camera does have like a lot of grain and all that stuff. Unfortunately, I don't know a great way to add grain inside of Blender. So that's something I did inside of Nuke that Nuke's like really great at. And so that helped match it a lot, but let's go ahead and play around with some settings just to match it a little bit nicer. So I will notice that the hole is a little too dark compared to the scene, so let's go ahead and add an exposure node to just lighten that up a little bit. Okay, you can play around with it, but around a 1 is looking pretty good for me. I need to go ahead and I want to decrease the saturation just a tad because it's a little too saturated right there. So that just helps, you know, get rid of some of the reds mostly. And then I want to go ahead and decrease the contrast. So I'm just going to add a brightness contrast node, and let's decrease some of that as well. Okay, so now with these 3 nodes, we basically just color corrected it a little bit more to kind of match, you know, how the camera would actually see it. What I can do now is I want to darken the area kind of around this hole a little bit. So what I want to do is actually use the alpha channel to affect our footage layer. So I'm going to go ahead and add a color balance to our footage. Just going to decrease the gain a little bit like that. And then we need to actually set this factor to be our alpha, like that. So now it's affecting basically the entire alpha of our thing. Of course, we can't see anything, and that's because we need to dilate it. Let's erode it a little bit. So I'm just going to put that there. And then I'm going to change this. Let's see. We're just going to change that up to like a 9. Just so it has like a little bit of the edge right there. Then, of course, we need to blur it. So let's add a blur. I'm just going to set it to fast Gaussian right there, and then let's increase this up to get a nice like subtle blur effect. And so now that bridges the gap a little bit more. You can see before and after. It just helps it kind of feel a little bit more realistic. Of course, you can do a lot more with this scene inside of other programs. I recommend DaVinci Resolve if you want to have a free compositing option, but this is a result that we're going to leave it inside of Blender. Again, the one thing I would recommend you doing if you do this on your own is, of course, adding a lot of grain to it. Again, Blender doesn't have a great grain node or any method I know how to add grain, and so that's what really sells the shot in my opinion. But this is the setup I would use inside of Blender to get a pretty good result on your end. We do need to play around a little bit with the motion blur and then also the depth of field just to really blend it into the shot. So let's go back out to the layout section. We want to go ahead and we can join these areas. We don't need these anymore. Let's go to the render properties, go down to motion blur. The lower you set it, the less motion blur, and then the higher you set it, the more motion blur. So I'm just going to change this to like a 0.6. I think I shot it in like a super high shutter speed. So there's not a ton of motion blur, but just because it's a phone, it has a lot of kind of weird artifacty motion blur type stuff. So next, let's go to the light paths. I'm going to set all these down to 3 just to speed up our scene. I'm going to change the reflective and refractive off. Change the fast GI approximation to a 2 just to have some faster rendering. And then of course I want to go to film, just hit transparent. I don't think we need it for the scene, but you never know. It's just kind of a rule of thumb I like to have. And then finally what we can do is I'm going to add a empty plane axis right there, and since it's in the origin, I'm just going to leave it at the origin. Now if we come up to the camera, we're going to go down to that, check depth of field, and then set it to be our empty object. And then 2.8 is way too high because everything is pretty much in focus, and so I want to change that up to, let's try like a 5.6 maybe. I'm just kind of looking at the depths down here to make sure. That's still a little too much. I'm maybe going to go to an 8. 8's looking much better. And so you can see, like, before we don't have any kind of depth of field blur down there, and now with it added, we can see it's much more realistic in how, you know, the iPhone would actually shoot it. And so now the final thing is just to render it out. You can either render it out as a movie sequence or a PNG sequence. Since it's going to render so fast on my end, I'm just going to render it as a movie sequence since it's going to render within 15 minutes. So if it ever, you know, does stop working. But of course, if it renders longer for you, I always recommend doing a PNG sequence so that if Blender crashes, you can always pick up back from where you left off. But again, I'm rendering it as a movie clip, so I'm going to go FFmpeg video, and then going to encoding, changing it to a MPEG 4. Or sorry, let's go ahead and do QuickTime, which is MOV format. And then let's go ahead and high quality, and we can go ahead and render the animation. Okay, so here is the final result. Hopefully you guys got something similar or learned something along the way to help out with your own projects. I'd really appreciate it if you consider liking and subscribing, as it would help out the channel. But anyways, I hope to see you guys in the next tutorial.